Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be reading out of National Geographic History magazine. I posted a poll on my community tab asking which articles you wanted me to read out of this. I didn't post this Viking one because I actually have a whole history magazine book about Vikings I want to read to you, and I found that way more interesting than this article. So don't worry, you're not missing out. The winning ones was about the Lighthouse of Alexandria and the birth of Jesus. So let's just dive right in and read about, starting with the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Look at this drawing of it. So beautiful. It says, near the mouth of the port of Alexandria stood a giant tower over 350 feet high. Its light shone so bright that contemporaries compared it to a star. Cool. Let's see the article here. I'll read it with my pointer pencil, of course. Here we go. The 7 wonders of the ancient world served a variety of purposes. Some were decorative, like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Others, like the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, were spiritual. While both beautiful and functional, the Lighthouse of Alexandria served a more practical purpose. Its shining light safely guided ships into the Egyptian harbor for centuries, placing the port city at the center of the Mediterranean trade in the ancient world. There's a cool map up here of Egypt. That's where Alexandria is. At least ancient Alexandria. Alexander the Great founded his eponymous city in 331 BCE when he was traveling through northern Egypt, escorted by a handful of men. Barely 3 years had passed since the start of the Macedonian king's campaign against the Persians, and he had already seized control of the coastal area of the eastern Mediterranean. In the Nile Delta, he decided to found a port that would ensure his control of the seas while also replacing the Phoenician city of Tyre, which he had just razed, as a trade hub. He soon found the perfect spot for the new city, a stretch of land connected to the Nile via the westernmost branch of the delta and protected by Lake Mariut on its southern side. In his biography of Alexander, Greek historian Plutarch reported an ominous event during the city's planning. When Dinocrates, Alexander's architect, traced the layout of roads and channels of the new city, he did not have any chalk at hand, so he used barley flour instead. No sooner had he finished his work than a huge flock of birds appeared, darkening the sky and devouring the flour. At first, Alexander was disturbed by what he thought was a bad omen, but his seers convinced him that it was a sign that his new city would provide sustenance for the whole known world. I'll show you all the cool pictures after we read. Dangerous waters. Alexandria was shaped almost like a perfect rectangle between the sea and Lake Mariut. Contemporary travelers compared it to a chlamys, an ancient Greek cloak. The city received its water supply via a canal connecting it with the Canopic branch of the delta, and its sewers and wide avenues were a rarity in the eastern Mediterranean. The Wonder City was divided into 5 districts, but nearly a quarter of its extension was occupied by the palaces and gardens of royal enclosures. The port was deep, making it suitable for ships with big draft, and the harbor was protected from dangerous northern winds by a string of islands. Still, without compass or navigational instruments, it was challenging to find one's bearings by observing the coastline. In the area around the Nile Delta, there are no mountains or cliffs. The coast is an endless landscape of marshes and deserts, and the land is so low that it sometimes seems to be hiding behind the sea. Another treacherous natural element was a great strip of barely submerged land, invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the coastal waters. Many sailors found that just when they thought the worst part of their journey was over, their ships would become stranded on this stretch of sand. A final hurdle was the double line of reefs in front of Alexandria, which could prove fatal to sailors and incoming ships if the winds weren't favorable. Clearly a lighthouse was necessary, but not just any lighthouse would do. The placement of the lighthouse was carefully selected. Off the coast of Alexandria was a small island, Pharos. It was celebrated in Greek culture, since it was in Pharos that Menelaus, one of the Greek warriors of the Iliad and the Odyssey, was stranded on his return from the Trojan War. According to Plutarch, Homer himself had appeared in Alexander's dreams to quote his own lines about the island. He said, "Now there is an island out in the ocean's heavy surge, well off the Egyptian coast. They call it Pharos. There's a snug harbor there." When Alexander awoke, he looked for the island, and, upon finding it, said that the ancient poet was not only admirable in other ways, but also was a very wise architect. In the westernmost part of the island, an islet barely separated from Pharos by the sea was selected for the new building. The lighthouse tower was a singular structure, the first of its kind erected by any civilization. It took the name of the neighboring island, and that is how the word Pharos came to mean lighthouse in Greek, with Spanish and Italian borrowing it for their pharo. The founder of the Greek dynasty of Egypt's pharaohs, Ptolemy I Soter, initiated building Alexandria's lighthouse. Ptolemy I was a Macedonian nobleman who gained control of Egypt after the aftermath of Alexander's death in 323 BCE. The project was completed during the reign of his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. According to Pliny the Elder, the Roman historian, one of these Ptolemies was generous enough to allow the name of the architect, Sostratus of Cnidus, to be inscribed on the very fabric of the building. Lucian, a writer from the 2nd century CE, had a more devious and fanciful explanation. After he had built the work, he wrote his name on the masonry inside, covered it with gypsum, and having hidden it, inscribed the name of the reigning king. He knew, as actually happened, that in a very short time the letters would fall away with the plaster and his name would be revealed. Blazing beacon. The building, like so many of the constructions erected by the first Ptolemaic pharaohs, was magnificent. Pliny noted that it cost 800 talents, about 23 tons of silver, to build, about a tenth of the king's entire treasury. By comparison, the Parthenon, built a century and a half before the lighthouse, cost roughly 469 talents. The lighthouse served its purpose perfectly. During the day, sailors could use it to navigate. At night, they could safely spot the harbor. Standing more than 350 feet tall, the lighthouse could be seen from 34 miles away, a whole day's sailing, according to the Jewish historian Josephus. The fire burning at the summit of the lighthouse was so bright that it could be mistaken for a star in the dark. During the day, the smoke alone made it visible from a great distance. Wood was scarce in Egypt, leading many scholars to believe the fire was fueled by oil or papyrus. It also seems profitable that a large burnished metal plank, or perhaps some kind of glass, was installed to act as a mirror, reflecting the glow of the flame. In medieval times, Arab authors, fascinated by the building, would fantasize that the mirror was in fact used like a magnifying glass to harness and direct the power of the sun against any enemy ship approaching the harbor, incinerating it before it could get any closer. Check it out. Pretty awesome for its time. Some scholars have considered the possibility that the lighthouse also featured an ancient foghorn that would sound when the coast was shrouded by clouds. Arabic accounts describe terrible voices coming out of the building. The exact mechanism for an audio warning has not been identified. Some speculate that the tritons blowing conch shells along the uppermost tier of the lighthouse could have served a practical purpose as well as a decorative one. A shining reputation. The lighthouse quickly became an object of admiration. Some ancient authors included it in their lists of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Those able to contemplate it closely, like Julius Caesar, were impressed by its height and its magnificent workmanship. The lighthouse remained an impressive symbol of pride and achievement. Roman coins from Alexandria dating to between the year 81 and 192 featured the tower. Despite its fame, the lighthouse was not impervious to the ravages of time. In the mid-1st century BCE, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra VII, commissioned the first restoration of the tower. When Arabs conquered Egypt nearly 700 years later, the lighthouse was still standing. Little by little, however, the earthquakes that shook Egypt during the Middle Ages destroyed the building. In the 14th century, Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler, expressed his distress at the sorry state of the building. By then it was probably impossible to gain access to the interior of the structure. In 1477, with the lighthouse reduced to a pile of ruins, a Mamluk sultan ordered that the remains be used in the construction of the citadel of Kait Bey, still standing today. The lighthouse was one of the most enduring of these 7 ancient wonders. Only the mausoleum of Harlequinassus and the Great Pyramid of Giza outlasted it. Let's go back and look at some of these cool things in here. Let's see. I want to see this page that I skipped. This shows the great harbor of Alexandria. Let's take a look. Back here is Lake Marut. The Baruchion, it says, the city's royal district. There's the lighthouse. The Soma, it says, a monument containing the embalmed body of Alexander. Its exact location remains a mystery. The Hepstadion, a causeway or breakwater for the port, and an aqueduct that supplied water to the island of Pharos. And up here we can see the Serapeum, a temple built by the Ptolemies, dedicated to Serapis, the Greco-Egyptian god. It housed the second most important library in Alexandria. Let's see. Pretty cool place. Here's a better view. How it looked. Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. There's the lighthouse, the Mediterranean, Lake Marut, and here's the Nile River coming out into the delta. We looked at this picture. That's pretty cool. Let's see. It says right here this is a mosaic of the lighthouse with the sun god Helios standing at its beacon. And this is what remains of it today, the citadel of Kait Bey, I'm not positive, but built out of the remains of the lighthouse. Isn't that interesting? And then we have this, Alexandria's Colossal Wonder. I want to read this. Let's take a look. Oops, sorry. Alright, it says, access to the tower-shaped lighthouse, whose height was greater than 350 feet, was gained via a ramp. Let's find the ramp. Oh, it's over here. You'd walk up there and go inside. The lower part of the structure was decorated with colossal pink granite statues representing the Ptolemaic pharaohs and their queens. The building was divided into 3 big bodies of decreasing size. The lowest was a square with sides each measuring about 98 feet. That's this big section over here, I suppose. The second had an octagonal plan, with the third housed a flame in the cylindrical structure sustained by columns. So here's the octagonal part, and up here's where the flame was. Enormous blocks of white limestone were used to build the lighthouse, which would have shined intensely under the Egyptian sun. Its walls had various openings which illuminated the interior and increased the edifice's wind resistance. So that's why these are there. Little windows. The corners of the upper floors were decorated with figures of Tritons forged in metal. Right here. Boom, boom, boom. And one on the other side, of course. Crowning the building was a bronze statue measuring 22 feet tall and representing the god Poseidon or Zeus. This part right here. Let's move on to the next article in here. The birth of Jesus. This is, of course, the November-December issue. So last magazine would have been September, October. So we got Vlad the Impaler. This issue, we get Jesus. So It says, with its shepherds and wise men, the Christmas story inspires wonder. Although many of the scenes of Jesus' birth are historically unverifiable, certain pieces can be tied to the events sweeping the world into which Jesus was born. Let's look at Jesus' birth in a historical context, which I think is really interesting. An infant in a manger, a brilliant shining star, and adoring shepherds. All are familiar parts of the Christmas story. For many of the world's Christians, the celebration of Jesus' birth occurs every December. It is a time of light and joy in which this ancient story takes center stage in churches through songs, sermons, and nativity plays. In the Bible, however, the traditional elements of the Christmas story are not presented in one single narrative, nor do they appear in all the Gospels of the New Testament. The events surrounding Jesus' birth are taken from two Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Each book was written during different times and in different locations. Although much remains mysterious about the Gospel accounts of Jesus' life, historians are using clues to shape their assessment of why two of the Gospel writers told the story of Jesus' birth in the way they did, and why the other two Gospels, Mark and John, do not mention his birth at all. I just remembered I should let you know that. I've never actually read the Bible or anything, so if I pronounce something wrong, please let me know, because I'd like to know a history of the Gospels. That Jesus of Nazareth was born and lived in the early Roman Empire is a matter of historical fact. In the early Christian period, Jewish texts that sought to discredit Jesus were not seeking to deny his existence. Other sources that testify to his existence are the Jewish writer and historian Josephus, who was writing in the late 1st century, and some decades later the Roman historian Tacitus. The Christians, Tacitus wrote, worship Christus, who suffered the death penalty during the reign of Emperor Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. No non-Christian source, however, describes the birth of Jesus. The only texts offering detailed accounts of Jesus' life are early Christian writings, principally the four Gospels that were regarded as a fixed part of the New Testament by the 3rd century CE. That guy always honks his horn like that, or locks up his car, anyway. For the many centuries following, these were regarded as entirely sacred texts. By the 18th century, however, scholars were beginning to try to place the creation of the Gospels in a historical context. Bible historians now consider that the Gospel of Mark was written first, since both Matthew and Luke heavily borrow material from Mark's account. Written at the end of the 1st century CE, the Gospel of John, whose themes are very different from the other three, is the last to be written. There is some consensus that the Gospel of Mark was begun during or just after the first Jewish revolt that began in the year 66. This revolt led to the Romans destroying the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in the year 70, an event referenced in Mark. The Gospel of Mark begins not with the birth of Jesus, but with his baptism as an adult. Once scholars had established that Mark's Gospel was written first, however, a new and intriguing idea took root. The authors of Matthew and Luke, writing perhaps around the mid-80s, 80s CE, had noted the absence of a birth story and decided to include one. Some biblical scholars believe that the Christmas story was a late addition to earlier versions of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and that it was added sometime in the 2nd century to establish links to his prestigious ancestors and his divine birth. If the great heroes of antiquity, like Alexander the Great and Augustus Caesar, had been furnished with impressive backstories after their deaths, wasn't it fitting that the Messiah should have one too? Divine accounts. Matthew and Luke both feature Jesus' birth, but they offer very different accountings. Each gospel highlights different parts in the story and omits others, placing their emphasis on specific elements. Matthew's narrative begins with a genealogy, listing the ancestors of the Holy Family and tracing Jesus' lineage many generations back to King David, while the Gospel of Luke begins with the angel Gabriel foretelling the births of John the Baptist to his father Zechariah, and then of Jesus to his mother Mary. The discrepancies continue into the nativity scene itself. Matthew seems more focused on events that come after Jesus' birth, including the visit of the Magi, the cruelty of King Herod, the massacre of the innocents, and the flight into Egypt. Luke omits these events and instead relates other details: the census ordered by Rome, Joseph and Mary's travels to Bethlehem, laying the child in a manger, and the adoration of the shepherds. The four Gospels were shaped by contemporary forces. The motives for including a birth narrative are probably rooted in the needs of Christian communities at that time. Questions could have been swirling among those earliest of Christian communities about the nature of Jesus' birth and lineage. Despite their differences, Luke's and Matthew's stories link Jesus both to his divine parentage and his earthly ties to the house of David, emphasizing Jesus' role in both God's plan and in Jewish history. Delving into both the historical Jesus and the creation of the Gospels, scholars have found instances where history and the biblical texts do not align. Questions arose, leading to more investigation into the story of Jesus' birth and why certain Gospels emphasized different events that have coalesced into the popular Christmas story. The story grew in popularity over the centuries as Christianity spread across Europe, especially after Renaissance artists depicted episodes from both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The Annunciation, the Nativity, Mary with the infant Jesus, the adoration of both the shepherds and the Magi, and the Holy Family's flight into Egypt. All were popular subjects for Europe's most famous artists, including Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. 3 out of 4 turtles. Strong visual representations further emphasized their place in Jesus' biography. These different scenes became even more strongly married together as nativity plays became a part of Christmas celebrations. St. Francis of Assisi is credited with staging the first one in 1223. St. Francis's biography, written by St. Bonaventure, details how the Pope gave permission to the monk to stage the scene, including a hay-lined manger, an ox, and a donkey, and to give a sermon about the baby Jesus. These plays became iconic parts of the Christmas celebration that are still performed today the world over, helping to solidify the prominence of Jesus' birth in the Christian tradition. Now let's go bit by bit through the story. Pick out any historical things that can be found about it. Little town of Bethlehem. The first reference to Jesus' home is in the oldest Gospel, Mark. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Nazareth was an obscure northern town, but Mark does not say if Jesus was born there, only that he lived there. The Gospel of Matthew names Jesus' birthplace, Bethlehem, a Judean town about 80 miles south of Nazareth in Galilee. More than just a location, Bethlehem is significant because of an Old Testament prophecy made by the prophet Micah, when Matthew quotes, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." The Gospel of Luke also names Bethlehem as Jesus' birthplace and details Joseph and Mary's journey there from start to finish. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. Luke 2:4. Luke also describes why a Nazarene couple who were expecting a baby made an 80-mile trek south to Bethlehem. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. Luke 2:1 and 3. Luke 1 through 3. Luke accomplishes two things in these passages. First, he emphasizes Joseph and his family's royal ancestry by linking them to King David, who was born in Bethlehem. When an angel announces Jesus' birth to the shepherds, Bethlehem is called the town of David. Some biblical scholars believe Bethlehem only enters the story because of its links to King David rather than being the actual birthplace, which they place in Nazareth. The census identified by Luke also complicates matters. History shows no census during the reign of King Herod, whom Matthew identifies as ruling Judea. The Roman governor of Syria, Publius Sulpicius Quirinius, did carry out a census in Judea in the year 6, about a decade after Herod's death. Historians are also skeptical that a census would prompt Joseph to travel to Bethlehem. Such censuses were held to specify the whereabouts of residents in a town for the purposes of taxing them, and did not typically require people to travel to an ancestral home. Part 2. Holy Night. The day and the year when Jesus was born has been subjected to much scrutiny. December 25th was first designated by the Church as the Christmas in the 4th century. This date clashes with the biblical sources, most notably with Luke's description of shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night. This passage suggests that Jesus was born in the springtime when shepherds are watching over the newly born lambs. One theory for the late December birth is that it places the Annunciation in March, 9 months earlier. Early Christians believed that late March was when Jesus was crucified. Having both his conception and death in the same month strengthened the sacred connections. There was also practical reasons for adopting December 25th as Christmas. That date was also the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, or unconquered sun, which celebrated the return of longer days after the winter solstice. Another mid-December celebration, the festival Saturnalia, was very popular among the Roman people. Its traditions of singing, lighting candles, feasting, and gift-giving were mapped out onto the celebration of Christmas. Determining the year of Jesus' birth would not come until several centuries later, when Dionysius Exiguus, a 6th century month, was determining the date of Easter for the next century. The late Roman world was then marking time in the years that had elapsed since the year 284, the beginning of Emperor Diocletian's reign. Dionysius felt it was inappropriate to use a system that honored a persecutor of Christians. Instead, he started to date the years from the year of the Incarnation of our Lord, or Anno Domini. His dating method began to gain acceptance and would eventually spread across Christendom. Dionysius's fixing of Christ's birth is ambiguous, but he implies it took place on December 25th in what is now recognized as 1 BCE. And then the counter notation of, well, BC at first wouldn't take root until many centuries later, and now BCE and CE is much more acceptable. My cat's snoring, by the way, if you hear any strange noises in the background. If 1 BCE was indeed the year Dionysius had in mind, then Jesus' birth contradicts the gospel sources. According to Matthew, Jesus is born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod. Most sources attest that Herod the Great died around 4 BCE, while the census ordered by Quirinius took place around 6 CE, about a decade after Herod's death. Also making it difficult to determine the exact year of Jesus' birth is the Star of Bethlehem, reported in Matthew to have guided the Magi to the newborn Jesus. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Several astronomical events could have been this glorious star that lit up the night, but astronomers and biblical scholars propose several strong candidates across a wide range of time. A conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter occurred in late 7 BCE. Chinese astronomers observed either a comet, a nova, or a supernova around 4 BCE. Another impressive celestial display would have been the conjunction of Jupiter and Venus on August 12, 3 BCE. Speculation as to the star's identity have even ranged to Halley's Comet, which is visible in the skies in 11 BCE. Now to the 3 wise men. Beautifully adorned and bearing gifts, the 3 kings are among the Christmas story's most recognizable characters. Their presence in Christmas carols and nativity plays are an example of how later Christian traditions became part of the modern celebration. Modern depictions of the Christmas story seem to compress the timeline of the Gospels, making it appear as though the 3 kings arrive in Bethlehem on the day of Jesus' birth. Traditional celebrations of Christmas place the arrival of the Magi 12 days after Christmas. Called Epiphany, or 3 Kings Day, it is one of Christianity's oldest holidays. Western Christians typically celebrate Epiphany on January 6th, and Orthodox Christian faiths celebrate it on January 19th. The source for the visit of learned men from the East appears in the Gospel of Matthew. The number of wise men is never specified, nor did the text identify them as royalty. Instead, their description is tantalizingly brief. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where's the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." After meeting Herod in Jerusalem, the Magi proceed until the star stopped over the place where the child was. On seeing the child, they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The term Magi offers a substantial clue to the identity of these visitors. Magi was a priestly class of the Zoroastrian religion practiced in Persia, which lay, as Matthew writes, east of Jerusalem, and was then part of the Parthian Empire. Magi is from Old Persian magush, meaning a person of great learning and esoteric powers, and is the root of the English words magic and magician. The Magi, therefore, were likely priests or court astrologers from Persia. Matthew's inclusion of the gifts was likely to reflect the more general Old Testament tradition of lavish foreign gift-giving, such as kings praising the Lord by bringing gold and incense. The Magi's gifts held symbolic meanings as well. Gold was a gift for royalty and signified Jesus' status as King of the Jews. Frankincense, an aromatic resin used in perfumes, represented the infant's divinity. Myrrh, also a fragrant resin, came from southern Arabia and was frequently used in embalming, which foreshadowed Jesus' mortality. In the centuries after the Gospel of Matthew was written, the three wise men have been interpreted as kings of different lands east of Judea. That they numbered three was established relatively early in Christian history, but the other details were filled in later. Starting in the 8th century, traditions further elaborated on their identities, giving them names and countries of origin. Melchior from Persia, Gaspar, also Caspar or Jasper from India, and Balthazar, who hails from Arabia or perhaps Ethiopia. Next up we have Herod the King. After worshipping the infant Jesus, the Magi, according to Matthew, are warned in a dream not to return to Jerusalem, where Herod is awaiting their information on the child. Their evasion enrages the king. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. The massacre of the innocents adds a streak of darkness to the Christmas story and has inspired centuries of revulsion among Christians. No historical record corroborates Matthew's account of the massacre. The Antiquities of the Jews, written by Judeo-Roman historian Flavius Josephus, offers a detailed portrait of the chaotic end of Herod's reign, but no gruesome massacre is mentioned. Such an incident would have appeared in other accounts, especially as Josephus was writing less than a century after Herod's death. One aspect of Matthew's story that is indisputably historic is the way the Herodian dynasty forms the backdrop to the birth, life, and death of Jesus. Born around 73 BCE, Herod began his career as a high-ranking Jewish official at a time when Roman influence over Judea was growing. Seeing the usefulness of having a loyal Jewish king, Rome made Herod king of Judea in 40 BCE. He trod a fine line between loyalty to Rome and preserving a degree of Jewish independence. He undertook magnificent building campaigns, including a grand expansion of the temple in Jerusalem. However, the Roman-style opulence of Herod's court angered his Jewish subjects and cost him their loyalty. The end of Herod's reign was marked by treachery and bloodshed. The king had many members of his own family killed, including his brother-in-law Aristobulus the Younger, his wife Mariamne, and, most brutally of all, her 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. This reputation for cruelty, attributed to both Herod the Great and his son, may well inform how the story of the massacre of the innocents arose. So while the massacre of the innocents is likely a legend, the brutality of Herod the Great was a political reality that overshadowed Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' birth. These tensions between Roman control, local Jewish pieties, and Herodian power run through the Gospel accounts of Jesus' lifetime. Following Herod the Great's death around 4 BCE, Rome divided rule of Judea, placing different areas under the rule of his children. Galilee was controlled by Herod Antipas, whose presence would loom large in the New Testament. His cruelty is demonstrated later in Jesus' life by his imprisoning and beheading of John the Baptist, as described in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, as well as in Josephus' Antiquities. This is a really beautiful painting. What is it by? Léon Cognier in 1824. It's very nice. Next we have the flight into Egypt. Luke and Matthew conclude their narratives in strikingly different ways. Luke recounts how an angel announced the divine birth to shepherds, who hurry to the manger to worship the baby Jesus. Soon after, the Holy Family swiftly moves to Jerusalem, where Jesus will be presented at the temple. By contrast, Matthew's Gospel concludes with high drama and an escape. Warned in a dream by an angel of the Lord in a dream. Okay. Joseph learns that Herod has sent men to kill his son. The angel tells Joseph to take his family and flee to Egypt, where they should stay. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Matthew 2:14 and 15. After Herod's death, an angel of the Lord appears again to Joseph in a dream and tells him that it is safe to take his family back home. Instead of returning to Judea, Joseph decided to go to Galilee, where Matthew explains, "But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea, Joseph was afraid to go there. He withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." Matthew 2:22 and 23. Archelaus, like Herod Antipas, was a son of Herod the Great, and was the governor of Judea. It is not clear from the historical record or from Matthew's texts why Joseph fears Archelaus. Some scholars believe that the reason itself is not important. The text allows Matthew to return the Holy Family to Nazareth in order to align with the Gospel of Mark. The flight into Egypt recalls other biblical stories, including Abraham and Sarah's journey to Egypt and the story of Exodus. Herod's brutal actions mirror that of Pharaoh's orders to kill the firstborn of Israel. Mary and Joseph's journey out of Egypt back to Israel parallels Moses' leading the people out of Egypt to the promised land in Israel. The story of the Holy Family's wanderings in Egypt was elaborated in several of the apocryphal Gospels, or texts excluded from the canonical New Testament, and generated a rich and highly complex tradition in which the Holy Family stayed in Egypt for years. The Egyptian Coptic Church, which according to tradition was founded by the Apostle Mark in the 1st century CE, places great importance on this part of the story. Numerous holy sites associated with the Holy Family's route sprang up across Egypt. Such sites are sanctified by a large stock of tradition centered on miraculous wells and springs from which the Holy Family drank, and palm trees under which they rested. These respites inspired many works of art, in which the Holy Family is rendered in quiet moments of intimacy and humility. And that is the end. Alrighty. That's it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I keep all these magazines, so I'll definitely do some bonus episodes later where you guys can pick more articles that I haven't read. I thought the Orient Express one was really interesting, and I love the Cahokia Mounds. They're so mysterious and really fascinating, so we can read those too on a later date. So keep an eye on my community tab and on my Instagram. I post things there too, asking things for you there. So anyway, thank you again. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very